An ordinary day on the quiet streets of La Paz, Bolivia. Between market stalls and the murmur of passers-by, a man walks with a confident stride. To everyone, he is Klaus Altmann, a respected German businessman who made his fortune in South America. But a dark secret hides behind that facade. His real surname is Barbie, and he was once known as the Butcher of Lyon. This notorious Nazi criminal earned infamy for torture, deportations, and executions during the German occupation of France. After the war, he did not seek redemption. He sought refuge, somewhere his story could fade into oblivion. Yet after decades, justice would finally catch up with him. In this documentary, we will meet Klaus Barbie, examine his influence on Bolivian espionage and politics, and uncover the intricate operation that ultimately forced him to answer for his atrocities. Respected and quietly feared, Klaus Altmann dressed with elegance, spoke with authority, and moved in the highest circles of Bolivian power. He was a prosperous businessman, a military advisor, a friend of generals. To many, he seemed an exemplary German, successful and well-connected. To others, he remained an enigma with a conveniently blurry past. Even then, few suspected that behind the mask stood one of the most feared men of the Third Reich. He had changed his name, his country, and his life. But beneath the surface, he was no ordinary entrepreneur. He was a war criminal who had stained the history of occupied France with blood. In La Paz, Klaus Barbie seemed untouchable, but the streets of Lyon had not forgotten him.
Crucial city, Lyon, at that time. A hotbed of a lot of French resistance activity. And the Gestapo, in order to counter this resistance, did so with the utmost brutality. And in Klaus Barbie, they had the perfect man to do it. He was essentially a butcher, and he did just see people as flesh that he could beat around, cut, abuse, inject, do what he liked with.
In 1942, that French city became a stage for terror. Under German occupation, Klaus Barbie rose to chief of the local Gestapo. From his office in the Hotel Terminus, he ran a machinery of relentless repression. Lyon, the heart of the French resistance, suffered ruthless persecution. Mass arrests, brutal interrogations, summary executions. Barbie did not aim merely to win militarily. He sought to break his enemies. Survivors described his methods as a descent into hell. Endless beatings, electric shocks, mutilations. Many never left those rooms alive. And those who did carried scars that would never fade. There was no safe haven. The brutal Nazi always found his prey, aided by a network of informants, fed by fear. That is how his name became synonymous with terror, and how the nickname that would haunt him forever was born: the Butcher of Lyon. In 1943, Klaus Barbie achieved what no other Nazi officer had managed. He captured the most wanted man of the Gestapo, the living symbol of the French resistance, Jean Moulin. What followed was an indescribable torment. In the basements of Lyon, Barbie personally oversaw the torture. The blows were incessant. Moulin never revealed a single piece of information. He died without giving one name. In that moment, Barbie did more than destroy a man. He struck the heart of the resistance and cemented his reputation as an implacable executioner. His reign of darkness lasted until the Third Reich began to crumble. While the Nuremberg trials prepared to expose the horrors of Nazism to the world, Klaus Barbie vanished into the tide of defeated soldiers. He knew that if captured, the gallows awaited him. But the Butcher of Lyon possessed an invaluable asset: the birth of the Cold War and his knowledge of communist networks coveted by the new masters of power.
After the war, he was hired by the Americans as an anti-communist agent.
They had known that he had this time in Lyon, which was brutal, but it was very much a case of kind of not wanting to know.
So he became an agent in the service of the American Secret Service, and he was working for the CIA afterwards.
At the beginning of the Cold War, the Americans, the British, the French needed men like Barbie to spy on the Soviets.
The US Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, knew about his past as a Gestapo officer, yet deemed him useful for his interrogation experience and his visceral hatred of communism. That is how Barbie found protection. American intelligence used him as an informant against the USSR, while covering his criminal past. For several years, he worked in Germany as a valued asset to the West. But when the flow of information dwindled and France began demanding his extradition, the stage grew complicated.
His contacts are drying up. The Americans know that the information coming in is poor, yet at the same time they don't want to hand him over to the French.
First thing Klaus Barbie is going to say, I've been working for the Americans. That would be deeply embarrassing.
So the Americans think, what are we going to do? We can't kill him. We can't give him to the French. We can't just let him lead a normal life. So we're going to have to help him escape.
In 1951, the CIC helped him escape through the rat lines, clandestine routes for Nazi fugitives. They provided papers under a false identity, and he sailed to Bolivia as Klaus Altmann. There he found a perfect refuge, a country convulsed by coups and power struggles, where men like him were welcomed for their military expertise and promises of order. He settled in La Paz, opened front companies, and gradually became an advisor to military regimes.
Nasty things, horrendous things he did served him well in Bolivia because he knew a lot about interrogation.
And he's using all his Gestapo experience to advise the dictatorships on how to deal with anybody who's against the regime.
So there were some really shady deals going on in the 60s and the 70s involving the military.
Altmann taught repression techniques, trained counterinsurgency, and offered his knowledge to smother any spark of opposition. His ties to generals and dictators guaranteed protection and privilege. In the salons of power, he was a frequent guest. In the barracks, his word carried the weight of a decree. While Europe sought him for war crimes, in South America, he built a new identity, respected and feared. He lived protected, as if justice could never reach him. In La Paz, his name was synonymous with business, contracts, and connections. The Butcher of Lyon had changed continents, not essence. In the promised land he had found, the shadow of his past still prowled. France continued to mourn its dead. The echoes of Lyon lingered in survivors' testimonies, in headstones of forgotten cemeteries, in faded photographs of families torn from their homes.
Barbie, on April 7, 1944, signed a telex telling that the children orphanage was liquidated by the Gestapo and that 44 children were arrested and deported.
The little ones, some barely 6 years old, were sent to Auschwitz. None returned. The contrast was brutal. While he negotiated contracts in South America, in Europe, his victims lay in anonymous graves. The numbers were staggering. In France alone, he is credited with sending 7,500 people to concentration camps, 4,432 direct murders, and the torture of more than 14,000 members of the resistance. The Butcher of Lyon was not a gratuitous nickname. It was an accurate portrait of cruelty unleashed with calculated coldness. And yet he lived on the other side of the world, under the protective shadow of Bolivian dictatorships. Every coup seemed to favor him, as if he always knew which side to choose. He became a security advisor, an arms supplier, and a collaborator in repressive strategies. For the military, he was indispensable. For the victims, he was another face of repression. The dictatorship considered him far too useful to hand over to foreign justice.
Klaus Barbie became the leader of a gang of torturers and killers working for the military dictatorship.
And they're called the fiancés of death. Barbie issues them with orders to go and do what they like and basically murder and pillage.
Capturing political opponents, torturing them and murdering them for a group of right-wing generals in Bolivia.
France, Jewish organizations and survivors demanded his extradition, but their pleas hit a wall of complicity. Altman moved freely, protected by a system that needed him. That protection, however, would not last forever. The world was changing. Latin American dictatorships were losing strength. What Barbie did not know was that his greatest enemy was not a judge, but the tireless memory of those who refused to forget. People who would not rest until they found him and made him pay. In 1971, an unexpected twist broke his impunity. In Lima, Peru, a woman who had been one of Barbie's victims recognized him in a newspaper photo. The German businessman visiting the country appeared smiling beside Peruvian officials. She did not hesitate. She sent the clipping to the Nazi hunting couple, Serge and Bette Klarsfeld. After comparing the image with archival photos from 1943, experts confirmed the identity. It was the Butcher of Lyon. From then on, the Klarsfelds became his shadow, launching a pursuit that would not stop until he faced a court. The campaign against Barbie grew and reached outlets like the New York Times, which sent reporters to interview the supposed businessmen. They failed and were even detained by Bolivian authorities. It seemed the ruthless Nazi had built an impenetrable barrier around himself. But in the 1980s, everything began to collapse. Bolivia started its path toward democracy. The generals who had protected him were pushed aside and the balance of power shifted. For the first time in decades, Klaus Altman sensed that the streets he once walked without fear were narrowing. The shadow of his past grew longer.
The fall of 1981 brings political upheaval to Bolivia. A pro-democracy movement forces out the country's authoritarian regime.
The Klarsfelds realized that it might be possible to try and get either the French or the West Germans to extradite Barbie
The fact that democracy returned to Bolivia was the beginning of his end.
The Nazi hunters returned with a new international campaign. They exposed his true identity, pressured governments, and mobilized public opinion. For the first time in years, Klaus Barbie knew what it meant to live in fear. The looks he received on the street were no longer respectful, but suspicious. The echoes of Lyon reached him even in his supposed refuge. Finally, in 1983, Klaus Altmann was arrested. Bolivia's democratic transition was unearthing too many uncomfortable figures, and the German businessman was now in the crosshairs. Once his identity was officially confirmed, there was no escape. He was sent to France, back to the scene of his crimes. The international press awaited him under a single name, the one he had tried to bury for 40 years. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. The man respected and feared in Bolivia arrived in handcuffs under the gaze of a world eager for justice. The contrast was stark. The advisor to dictators, the prosperous businessman, now appeared a frail old man, exposed to camera flashes and the shouts of reporters.
¿Y volvería usted a vivir? ¿Volvería a hacer lo mismo?
Mira, nunca se puede hacer lo mismo en la vida, porque la vida en cualquier forma, si se repetiría, sería otra. La vida produce muchas casualidades, muchos errores.
¿Usted cometió algunos errores?
¿Usted no ha cometido errores en su vida?
The proceedings against Klaus Barbie became historic. Accused of crimes against humanity, he faced a French court in 1987. It was not only a trial of one man, but a reckoning with the memory of Nazi horror. Among the witnesses, Simone stood out. At barely 13, she had been savagely beaten by Barbie in front of her mother. He wanted to break the woman's will so she would betray her sons in the resistance.
Il arrivait avec son sourire mince comme ça, comme une lame de couteau. Il me posait la question, il me frappait. Il me frappait à coups de poing, à coups de pied. Il m'a fichu par terre combien de fois et relevé à coups de pied. Il m'écrasait la figure à coups de poing sur les plaies qui étaient déjà à peine refermées de la veille. Je dois dire que ça a duré 7 jours environ, cette petite sérénade.
The testimonies reconstructed in stark detail the torture, the deportations, the deaths. Barbie listened without remorse. The court did not judge emotions, but facts, and the facts were incontestable. He ordered persecutions, he tortured, he sent children to Auschwitz. The sentence was clear: life imprisonment.
His attitude did not change. There was absolutely no remorse for what he had done.
And never a sign of regret, never a word of regret, and no word of the victims, you know.
On July 4th, 1987, 16 years after the Klarsfelds began their hunt, Barbie is found guilty.
The former Gestapo chief showed no emotion as a sentence of life imprisonment was passed.
France, a nation that had mourned its heroes and martyrs, now saw the butcher of Lyon become a prisoner. In his cell, far from the power he once wielded. Klaus Barbie died in 1991. He tried to outwit history, but history caught him. And in the very country where his name had become synonymous with terror, he met his end. The executioner died alone, remembered as one of the most infamous criminals of the 20th century. Barbie's story shows that justice can be delayed, but it does not disappear. For 40 years, he believed he had buried his past beneath a false name and a life of privilege in South America. Yet the voices of victims and the memory of survivors proved stronger than any wall. His capture and conviction were not only a legal triumph, but a moral one. Proof that neither time nor borders erase responsibility for crimes against humanity. But his case also leaves an open wound. There were those who hid him, those who benefited from his knowledge, and those who protected him in the name of political interests. That complicity prolonged the victim's suffering and delayed justice. The memory of the butcher of Lyon is more than the story of a Nazi criminal. It is a warning about what happens when memory is silenced and convenience outweighs truth. And so we reach the end. If you enjoyed this video, we look forward to seeing you in our next episode as we continue exploring military history.